Okay, in this video we're going to continue at the bottom of page 594, and we're going to look at anonymous classes. And the whole anonymous thing might be familiar to you from working with either jQuery or JavaScript, where we often will declare functions that are anonymous, and they just kind of do what they do, and we don't really need to call them by name because they're just there to perform a task. Now that's possible here in Java as well, and it is, as it says here, a class without a name, and then it combines defining an inner class and creating an instance of a class into one step. So it's kind of a neat little time saver. So take a look at how this is set up. If we were to use an inner class, in other words, we have our whole application and we're inside the start method here, and then we set up a separate class to handle the enlarge handler. This is in essence creating a new instance of this class. Now if we did an anonymous class, notice that what we're doing here is we just simply strike the class definition and the fact that it's implementing the event handler, and we just say new event handler. We don't bother to name it, we don't bother to say what it's implementing. We just go ahead and we do it, and we put it right inside the set action of the button. So it really saves a significant amount of work, because we're not going to be using this class, at least not in this circumstance, outside where we would need to maybe call it by name and invoke it. We're just using it right in place, so this is actually a perfect scenario for it. Alright. So it is still considered an inner class, so we treat it much the same way, and that's basically what this little section is about. Now in this next example here, we are going to be running this little demo, and they do have a little video note here, so those of you that have access to the companion website and signed up, and you should by using the code on the inner cover of your book, you can shuffle off and watch this little video from the author, and I think you may find it helpful, or you can just listen to me talk, whatever is your choice. But let's take a look now at what the code is doing, and in this case we're setting up all these different buttons that we're seeing in the form here. So we have a new open, save, and print. And then here we have those same things. So we just gave them all a new instance of a button, gave them a name. We put all of them up on the screen. They're all in a horizontal box. So I think that's all pretty straight ahead. And then here we are showing the method that we just looked at, which is creating an anonymous class on the fly put within a set on action method. So that whole thing is happening right inside there, and that includes, if you notice, doing the override, having a method within it, and that whole thing, the whole job of it is to just simply do an output. So we see on the screen something like this. But the point is really how we set up that anonymous class, and really, as they indicate here, it's an anonymous handler to handle the event. Alright, and that's just replicated a few times, once for each button, and there's not really much more to it than that. So that anonymous handler really can be quite handy. Clearly it saves a lot of lines of code. I think it's pretty clear as to what it does, so it's really kind of a good approach to use for doing particular things. Now the next thing, following along very much the same line of thinking, which is to find more efficient ways to get some of this done, so you're not writing 40 lines of code when you can write 10, is this concept of Lambda expressions. And they're something that has been added recently. They've been messing with this for a while, and here it's actually officially now part of Java and Java 8. And It says Lambda expressions can be viewed as an anonymous class with a concise syntax. So it says, for example, the following code in A can be greatly simplified using the lambda expression in 3 lines. So take a look at the setup here. Now this is what we moved to in the previous example, where we went and we created an anonymous class, because that's what this is. We don't have a name and we don't have an implement that sits right in this spot. So we just evoke a new event handler without a name. We just use it. We do our override, and then we do our handle. So in other words, what the handler is going to do. But notice the significantly simplified syntax here. And I'm going to have to pause for a moment, but I do want to finish this thought, where it says same setup, button enlarge, set on action, and then look at the syntax. Just E with a little pointer, and that just assumes it's an event handler, that's a new instance, and it's going to set up the approach for handling or registering that event with a particular handler. So I'm pausing here for a moment to plug in, and I'll be right back. Okay, now I'm all plugged in and charging. I want to move down to the lower part of the page here now and take a look at just the general form of how these expressions work. So you can put within the expression obviously a data type and some particular parameter, and then some sort of an expression, or you can actually have a whole series of statements that goes with it as well. It just really kind of depends on your scenario. Notice here that says the data type for a parameter may be explicitly declared or implicitly referred by the compiler. So the parentheses can be omitted if there's only one parameter without an explicit data type. So that's pretty powerful too. So you can actually boil it down to just that, and you gotta love the simplicity of it. Now it won't apply in every situation, but where it does apply, there's no reason why you wouldn't want to go ahead and use that. Now this being a fairly new approach, you're not going to see a lot of examples out there working in other people's codes, but there's no reason why you shouldn't try it, and I'm sure there's plenty of good information out on the web if you want to look at examples of people doing this. All right, now it makes a little note here that says the compiler treats the lambda expression as if it's an object created from an anonymous inner class. So it understands that these other components like the event handler and the action event are intrinsic to this. So it's kind of like a shorthand, really, is a nice way to say it. So if we look now at building that same little thing with the 4 buttons, new, open, save, and print, and then taking those statements and boiling them down, and I just want to show you where we're coming from, where we went here and we actually created a class, and then we found a way to do that without the event handler, and I'm trying to find the shortened code here, that how we keep getting truncated smaller and smaller and smaller, and that's what's happening here. So we've taken all of that now and boiled it down to this simple statement. So button new, set on action, action event E. We got our little pointer in there, and we just do the output. And here, it's starting to look a little bit like jQuery almost, and that's really kind of the approach, because that mindset of creating a library that kind of like truncates things down for you is a powerful thing. And just the the volume of lines of code that we save is worth the effort. All right, we're going to pick up now on page 600, and here they have a case study, and I would encourage you to take time to go through this code and work with it. Of course, the source is provided, but if you want to play with it, I think that it would be to your benefit. And then we're going to do something that looks like, like first couple of weeks of doing our Intro to Programming class, and that is basically create a simple application. Notice that we have a grid pane so that we can have rows and columns. We have just some plain text, and then we have some text fields, and then a button. All right, so we need to do certain steps as we're creating a program, and that's what they're trying to indicate here. And first thing they have you do is actually create the interface. So you create the grid pane, add those items. We set the alignment so everything is, right to the right point, and it's also, so all the text aligns in that fashion. And then finally, we set up an event handler that will react to the button click and then process the math that needs to be done and then give us an output in the right spots. All right, and here's the code for that. Now I'm just going to kind of quickly rifle through it, but you can see like the setup that they have here. I don't think it's too hard for you to figure out at this point how it goes, but we do have all the things that are typical with forms, including labels and text boxes and buttons and all those things. So follow that and build it. Then they set up all the different properties for the user interface. So they take all these particular items, they do a set and alignment, and they're positioning it to the bottom and to the right. And then they also show some of the text fields that some of them are not editable. So this is not dissimilar from the approach that we use in Visual Studio, working with like Visual Basic or C#, where we go into the properties window and just choose these things from a drop-down. Now we don't have that benefit here in this environment, but when we do know some of the commands, and you will build up a library of them as you move along, you'll start to remember more of them. And we're just making it so that those two fields, basically the ones that are going to show the result, that you can't change them. We're setting the editable to false. We don't want the user going in there changing their house payment or their interest rate. That's going to be adjusted. All right, and this part here, this is where we actually perform the action. Now look at how simple this is. So we do react to the clicking of the calculate button. We do the set on action. We invoke and register the event handler, and that executes this particular method. Now of course that method is spelled out here, so all the math that goes on and the output to the text boxes, that all happens within this method. But it's pretty powerful that we can just have this little thing here that does so much, partially from the help of this little pointer. Okay, so this next section here, we're looking at events that are based on mouse movements, clicks, drags, drops, and all those things. Now, you should be at least somewhat familiar with mouse events, in terms of every time you move the mouse across the screen, it will have an X coordinate and a Y coordinate relative to the position of 0, 0 here. And so that's one thing that you can actually check by virtue of these little methods that they've declared. And then notice that the coordinates can be relative to the source node, which would be the top right of any window that you're, or excuse me, top left of any window you're in, the top relative to the top point in the scene or in the screen altogether. So you have to keep those in mind, that those are relative to whatever you want it to be. So it can be the whole screen, it can be within a scene, or it can be inside whatever particular little component you're in right now. Now notice that we also have some additional things here. It says returns true if Alt or Control or Meta or Shift key is pressed. So those are sometimes used in combination with mouse clicks. So if you're wondering why they're listed here. What does the Alt key or the Control key have to do with mouse click? Because sometimes that's used to invoke alternate states of the click. Those of you that are on Macs will know that before they actually made right click available on a Mac, they kind of simulated that by having you press the Control key and clicking to get that right click or the context menu. Okay, as we're working along here, you notice that they're pointing out that there's 4 constants that are defined, and that is primary, secondary, middle, and none. So you should be familiar with what these means. Now, typically a primary is a left click, and secondary is a right click. But in a lot of programming circles, we don't call them that because sometimes people are left-handed and they switch. So the right click can actually be the primary click. So I think you get the idea. Of course, we have our middle click, which these days is usually the press of the scroll wheel, and then we have none. And we can actually get reactions to all of those particular things. Now, once again, the author has a video note here, so if I would encourage you to go off and look at that. We're going to try to do that in the classroom environment. But if you're not doing that, then you want to come in here and you just want to play with this one a little bit. And it's a very simple application. We're basically setting up a window, and then we have a little bit of text that we drop in. And then notice what this is doing. It says text.setOnMouse dragged, the event handler, and we are getting the X and the Y position, and we're setting it to that. So this one I actually kind of want to bring up on screen because it's easier to see what it does. And actually they're kind of giving it away here. But let's bring up mouse event demo. So I'm going to go to my folder here. I'm going to drop this down on top of Eclipse and pull it into my project. Let's double click to open. I'm going to get rid of that package. Let's expand the library just to see the stuff that we're working with. And let's go ahead and run it. I don't see any underlines anywhere. So you notice right now how programming is fun, but it doesn't really do anything. Remember, what we're reacting to is set on mouse dragged. Now, in order to drag, you do have to click, and then notice you can just click and drag. So that's pretty powerful, and really that's all happening because of this little bit of code here, and because of we're using a Lambda expression, which really significantly cuts down on the amount of code that we need in order to get it to happen. So if you can imagine applying this to other scenarios, very quickly we have created like a drag drop thing here. So hopefully you found that one interesting at the very least. Now, just the way that we can react to mouse events, we can also react to key events, which we mentioned earlier. And the other thing to be aware of is, you know how we had the 4 control keys, and if this would be a question I would ask in class. So what is the meta button? And that is a great question. Well, the meta button is that extra key that we use on the keyboard, but also it is a button that we can have on the mouse that can react. So sometimes we have programmable buttons on the mouse, and that is one of the things that can be triggered. Now, in terms of what these keys are and what they do, so here's some of the key codes that we can react to. So we have all these different keys, and you should be familiar with these. And then notice that all letters and numbers are just dropped into 2 listings here. But basically, this represents all the major keys on the keyboard and ones that we can have reactions to. So, you know, you should kind of like look at this in terms of how you would look at you know, working with, let's say, a game program where sometimes you can customize the key mapping for playing a certain game, or certain keys are relative to certain actions. And that's kind of the mindset that we have here. So in this example, we are going to actually be using the keyboard now to do kind of the same thing that we were using to do with the mouse before. There's not really a lot of code here to look at, but the thing that's triggering it basically is this on key pressed. We got our lambda expression here, and then we look for a certain thing to happen. So we have a switch statement, and we get our code, and then we look for up, down, left, right, and then when that happens, we execute this statement. So we are basically setting the Y position, either plus or minus, setting the X position either plus or minus, and so down would be plus 10. Now keep in mind you start at 0, so plus goes this way and plus goes that way. And then ultimately they have this default. So it says if a character is letter or digit, it's pretty clear what that does. Then we set the text to match whatever that character is. Now notice one last thing here is that text field is set to request focus. And what request focus does is it basically tells the program that this is what's going to grab whatever input that is. So focus, remember, is the thing that draws attention in the program. I think this one would be a fun one to run too. So let's go ahead, and this one's called Key Event Demo. Let's go pull that one in too. And let's bring that up. Get rid of this package file. Let's check our libraries. I always like to do that, see what things are present. Now notice that because we are using Lambda expressions, notice that we are not doing any event imports. So that's kind of an interesting thing too. I'm going to go ahead and save, and then I'm going to run. Alright, so right now you see that we have the letter A, and you can see I can arrow left, up, down. It's a pretty small little window there, probably make it bigger. But see, I can move it any direction, and then if I type a different letter, I get that letter. And this is very, very exciting. Alright, I think you get the point. Now let's jump back over to the book for a sec. And that was basically our key event demo. Now, this next example, and this is one you probably want to drop into Eclipse, is going to allow us to control that circle with the mouse and the keyboard. So this is kind of a powerful little combination too. Notice that we're doing a little bit of combining here, that we have our enlarge and shrink button. See how we are now using our lambda expression to enlarge and shrink. And then we're setting up some conditions here. So if we are clicking, we will enlarge. So if we click the primary button, if we click the secondary button, we will shrink. And then if we press certain keys, we will either enlarge or shrink. And notice that we're using U and D. And then once again, the circle pane is going to request focus, and that's so that we can react, or it would grab that input. Let's go ahead and bring that one into the project and take a look at what it does. And I don't know what it's called. So let's go back. Control circle with mouse and key. I'll bring that over to Eclipse. Drop it in, copy it over, open it. Let's get rid of that. You can see that the buttons work. And if you use our U, capital U, and those buttons don't seem to be working Okay, and I think I'm seeing that they have a typo in the book here, or either that, yep, they do have a typo. So they have key code U and key code D, and it should really be up and down. So if I want to make that circle bigger or smaller, I just use my up and down arrow key to do that. Or I can use the buttons, which is kind of fun. Okay, so now we're going to pick up at the bottom of page 606 in section 1510. And the thing that we're adding now are what are called listeners for observable objects. So now keep in mind that thus far we've been working with things like buttons, which we expect will have a listener on it. We'll have an event handler. But we can also add a listener to things that are not buttons or any object that we have up on the screen. So notice the syntax here, and we just simply say add listener, and then we invoke a new invalidation listener, and that basically is going to perform this action that we see here. All right. Now, the next little example here, they show a resizable clock, and this is kind of building on that example. And there's, now if you were doing that clock demo in the previous chapter, if you played with that at all, this should look fairly familiar to you. But the point really of this example is to look at these last two statements here, and that is the fact that we have the pane and then its width property, and then we're adding a listener that's going to allow us to set it. And I also notice the change in syntax here with that OV, and where that comes from is from the fact that it's something that's observable, and then that is the little acronym that they use for that, so if you're wondering where that comes from. But once again, that's a Lambda expression to allow us to write a lot less code and save us a lot of time, really. All right, well, this video ends here, and the next one we'll pick up where we're leaving off, and we'll discuss animation.